their family history before? Awesome! I'm here to tell you a story of intrigue and scandal about my ancestor, my great-great-great-grandfather, the Reverend Edward Weldon Dunbar, who was born in New York, but his people come from Connecticut. I heard stories growing up about the traveling preacher, Edward Dunbar, and his 3 sons, who were all lay preachers. I ended up doing years of research and wrote an article about it. However, he was very famous, or infamous, if you will, long before I wrote an article about him. In 1844, at the age 20, he moved to New Bedford, where he got a job on a whaling ship. He ended up working on it for 4 years with a guy named Zachariah Jenny. And in 1848, when the ship came in, Zachariah introduced Edward to his sister Caroline. They were married a year later. After Edward and Caroline married, he was a minister in New Bedford, and then he was a minister on Nantucket. They returned to New Bedford, where he ended up traveling a lot, selling Bible cards, getting paid for his lecturing, and for his singing. I was told that he wrote a lot of songs, and I actually found 2 hymns and hymnals. I also found documentations of his skills as an orator and as a singer. Believe it or not, I found on the internet a transcribed diary that said, "Heard a good part of the sermon last night announced by Reverend Dunbar. A weighed in the balance and found wanting. His voice was powerful and the hills on both sides seemed to speak the same words to each other, and the echoes of those words sent forth on the evening air resounded for miles around." That's what Murillo wrote in 1857. And in 1862, at age 39, Edward enrolled in the Union War, or on the Union side of the war, sorry. And he was, a year later though, he was discharged because he was unfit for duty due to sciatica of the legs and diabetes. And then I lose him. I can't find him. And in the 1880 census, I find his wife Caroline listed as a widow, which I thought was normal because in the Civil War, a lot of veterans ended up dying young from war wounds. However, I didn't realize it was also very common for women who were deserted to also be listed as widows. And so I continued to actually look for Edward in the death records until somebody found me an article about an Edward Dunbar from New Bedford who was in jail in Minnesota. So I looked up the census records, and sure enough, in 1870, that's where he was. I actually wrote to the Historical Society for inmate records, and sure enough, it was my guy in jail for polygamy. At age 44, he was admitted, and he ended up being 6 feet tall, 2 inches, with red hair. And then I dug deeper, and I found articles, hundreds of articles. He was a national sensation in 1867. It appears in 1866, he married a younger woman with family money, Eunice Lewis. He ended up actually changing his faith from Methodist to Baptist. He became the Lewis family's Baptist minister. And then when people started getting suspicious, he skipped town. And by June of 1867, he was in Leavenworth, Kansas with his brother, Reverend Charles Dunbar. They were there leading revival meetings and teaching Sunday school, and the locals were falling in love with them. And they quote, "for their unselfish and self-sacrificing zeal in carrying the good news." Newspapers reported Edward's skill as an orator. He has been known to bring whole congregations to tears with his melting strains and singing, and wherever he went, folks took a shine to him. However, back in Minneapolis, Eunice's father hires a private detective who finds Edward in Kansas and actually follows him and sees him cut his hair, shave his beard, buy a new suit, and buy glasses as a disguise. However, he is still brought back to Minnesota. However, his wife Caroline, now in Massachusetts, takes the trip to Minnesota with her sister Elmira and brother Zachariah. Zachariah testifies, Caroline does not. No one testifies on Edward's behalf. And at age 44, he is sentenced to 3 years and 8 months of hard labor at Stillwater Penitentiary. Unfortunately, when he arrives, he's actually put in the dungeon for 3 days for damaging machinery. An interesting note, too, is you can see the little pen stripes. That was a new program that was created under the warden at Stillwater while Edward was there. He was pardoned in 1870. And then, again, what happens to him after that? I don't know, for 20 years until he dies, and then there's a whole other series of newspaper articles. He dies in Coffeyville, Kansas, a beggar and a vagabond. There are articles that talk about how locals put markers on his grave, and there's another one that says his body was exhumed and moved back to the family home. But where is that? In New Bedford, the family plot actually has 10 spots. 9 have been used, the 10th is just reserved. However, it's never been proven that it's been used, and I've never found burial records for Edward. However, I'd like to think that his 3 sons brought him back. For how else did I get his 1864 diary, which I rediscovered when I was writing the article? The diary talks about sending money to his wife and children, and that he was a committed man who traveled a lot for his job in Dun and Bradstreet. He was sad and lonely. He attended and gave lectures, and he was very much a supporter of Lincoln and the Union. I'm still transcribing it. So since writing the article, I have discovered he sang for President Lincoln in 1863, and he likely impregnated 2 young women. One was on Nantucket in 1858, and the other in St. Louis in 1860. I've begun corresponding with the family from St. Louis. Seems the story will never end. Thank you.